I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source. Call this Mrs.Dalloway's podcast. We're reading classic fiction from a century ago for light on the strangeness of the world in our day, or maybe just for relief, reading a great old book. The dazzling young critic Merve Emre is our guest and our guide to Virginia Woolf's modernist masterpiece, Mrs.Dalloway, from 1925. The novel is a day in the life or a slideshow in the mind of a rich, ruling class lady in London, volubly in love with life, out shopping for flowers on Bond Street on a morning in June for a party she'll be giving at home that evening. But Mrs. Dalloway is also a novel of ruin alongside rapture. The second major character, Septimus Smith, is a veteran of World War I, broken by combat and shell shock, considering suicide because in his madness he supposes that only killing himself would allow him to honor life as it should be lived. Welcome, Merve Emre. We owe you big time for your annotated edition of Mrs. Dalloway. You write, "Together, the sane and insane love of life created the frame for Virginia Woolf's novel." To my mind, that makes it a sort of a prophetic parable of the disarray in our own world, in our heads in 2025. What connections do you draw out of the novel into our world 100 years later?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Maybe I can draw a couple of connections between the day on which Mrs. Dalloway throws our party and the days that we are living through, trudging through perhaps now. So when I started annotating Mrs. Dalloway, it was March 2020, a memorable month for so many of us. And then at that point, there was a very direct connection between the novel and the time that we were living through. Clarissa Dalloway is walking out of her house into the streets of London after having suffered from and recovered from the Spanish flu. One of the very first things that we see, or one of the very first characters that we meet, is her neighbor Scrope Purvis, an entirely minor character whose only function is to tell us that Clarissa Dalloway has grown very white since her illness. So back in 2020, there was a really direct connection between a woman reliberated into the streets of London after an illness and the illness that we were seeing all around us. There was also a very direct connection, I thought, between the spectacle of mass death that Clarissa Dalloway herself had experienced during World War I and the mass death that we were then all witnessing in those early days of the pandemic.
Interesting.
Yeah, so when I started annotating Mrs. Dalloway, those connections felt almost unsettlingly close to me. Fast forward 5 years to 2025, there is an almost unbelievable amnesia, I think, among people about what we all lived through 5 years ago. And now the connections seem perhaps a little more tenuous, but I think they are still there. Mrs. Dalloway gives us a portrait of the English ruling class, of its government officials and its elites at the very moment that the empire is crumbling. And a tried and true conservative way of life is giving in to an uncertain future. And for me, when I look around at what we are all living through, the kind of garish spectacle of cruelty among our conservative ruling elites, I see the end of the American neoliberal empire, and I see both the terror and hopefully the possibility of what can come after it. So I think Mrs. Dalloway is in many ways an elegy for a conservative way of life. And I would like to think that much of the pain that we feel about public life in America right now is also the beginning of an elegy for its horrors.
Wow, that's hopeful. That's a lot to work on. Let me ask you my last question first. Why is this book so much fun to read? And by the way, Big Ben tolling in his bell tower every half hour throughout this book is part of it. I'd forgotten the pleasures of this book. It's a post-war novel, as you say, a post-pandemic novel, a novel of post-colonial England, India yet to be India entirely, but all of it with links forward to our world today. It's a novel also of erotic energy and its many varieties then and now. You write in your introduction, what made Mrs. Dalloway a modern novel was its capacity to melt away the distinction between inner and outer worlds and leave hanging between them an extraordinary mist of beauty in language. I wonder, don't we feel this novel trying, in effect, to give form to that mist? Isn't the mist sort of at the heart of it?
I absolutely think so. And I think in front of, or in the foreground of the spectacle of death and cruelty, colonial cruelty, there is a woman who is absolutely in love with life and who walks around London seeing life everywhere. So let me just read
Please.
From the beginning of the novel. You mentioned Big Ben striking. And after Big Ben strikes for the first time on the second or third page of the novel, Clarissa Dalloway thinks, "Such fools we are," she thought, crossing Victoria Street. "For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries sitting on doorsteps do the same, can't be dealt with," she felt positive, "by acts of parliament for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment of June. Isn't that just extraordinary? It's music. It's about music. It's about the sound of the city, the brass bands, the barrel organs, the singing of the airplane. And it is utterly musical, the way those sounds, those items, the people are strung together by Virginia Woolf in the mind of Clarissa Dalloway. You use the word rapture in your introduction. I think this is rapturous prose. This is prose that is trying as hard as it possibly can to fix the ephemeral and then to let it go, to give us the sense of living in a moment, of being completely flooded by that moment, our sight, our sound, our taste, our touch, and to continue moving through the stream of life, the stream of time. And it's that life that I think this novel is always opposing to death and the politics of death.
That's marvelous. I'd love you to speak more of Virginia Woolf's modernity itself and her influences and where they show up. Among other things, I'm wondering how many people could even get into that world that she's, that magical, musical, as you say, space that she's defined.
You know, she was a very close reader of poetry. She translated Greek. She read Chaucer. In her essay collection, The Common Reader, she writes about every major English poet, and her diaries give us evidence that she was deeply conversant with Milton, with Wordsworth, with Byron, with Emerson, with Proust. She was also very acutely aware of her competitors for the title of the most innovative or the greatest modernist. One of the things that she writes in her diaries when she's trying to plot out the exact structure of Mrs. Dalloway is that she doesn't want the hard, cold, objective referentiality of somebody like T.S. Eliot. She does not want to write a poem like The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And she's equally disdainful of the deep, almost unmediated interiority created by a novelist like James Joyce. And she's disdainful of that for reasons that are, appallingly bigoted. She doesn't like working class Irishmen scratching their pimples in public, as she puts it in her diary.
Oh, God.
So she's trying to find, as you say, she's trying to find that mist. And for me, that mist is a way of toggling between the objects of the external world, what one sees when one walks down the street in London on a day in June, and the way that different people perceive the same objects. So that what she creates in this novel isn't just a deep dive, a plunge into the mind of one person, but something like a collective consciousness that hangs in the city, hangs over, and envelops all of the people in it. And I think that's what makes her distinctly modern, that interest in capturing a collective consciousness that has incredibly individual aspects to it, but ultimately can't be grounded in the body or the mind of a single character.
Can I just say, people always talk about her and Joyce partly because she and her publisher husband declined to publish Ulysses. There had to be tension there. Speak of one particular scene in that morning walk when she's shopping for flowers. Suddenly, people think they hear a shot, but in fact, it's a motor car backfiring. And then, minutes later, there's skywriting, early skywriting, advertising in the sky over London, and all sorts of characters in the novel see it. It's a unifying moment, a sort of democratic moment, you could argue, also a tech moment. Skywriting might be the AI of 1925. But tell us why that sticks so.
One of the reasons I love that scene, and Virginia Woolf worked very hard on that scene, is because it creates that aesthetic of the mist. It is a moment where there is an external object that everybody on the ground near Buckingham Palace looks up and sees.
Right.
And you have an unbelievable cast of characters. You have these poor mothers of Pimlico who are giving suck to their babies. You have elder men like little Mr. Bowley, who had rooms in the Albany and was sealed with wax over the deeper sources of life, looking up at the sky. You have shawled Moll Pratt, an Irish woman who's selling flowers on the street. And all of a sudden, they're all looking up at the sky, trying to make sense of what is being written.
Those letters.
And they each have different readings, different interpretations of those letters. And one of the wonderful things I think about that scene is how many different people can be seeing the same thing but perceiving it in utterly different ways. I think if we want to draw connections between 1925 and 2025, we might think about how all of us are often treated to the same spectacles, how the same images circulate in all of the various media forms that we have access to, and how they can evoke so many different kinds of responses in us based on our own nationalities, ethnicities, political positions, how in touch we are with our own deeper sources of life, what Mr. Bowley is not, in fact, in touch with, really. Whether we are mothers, whether we are fathers, what our class positions are. And to me, one of the incredible things about that scene is how utterly efficient it is in calibrating an entire social world to a single spectacle, the skywriting that's going on.
One more question about Virginia Woolf's style, her modernity, her individuality. Mark her influence in particular writers. And is there a line in fictional prose, in fiction making, between pre-Woolf and after Woolf?
To my mind, one of her best readers and one of my favorite kind of crypto-Woolfians is the literary critic Elizabeth Hardwick, one of the founding editors of the New York Review of Books.
Yep.
After her quite spectacular separation from the poet Robert Lowell, wrote an incredible little book called Sleepless Nights, which I imagine many people have read. To my mind, one of the things that Hardwick takes from Woolf and makes entirely her own is a sense of impersonality, that in writing, one is telling a story that is not particular to the individual, but telling it with a style that is so distinctly personal, so singular, that no one could mistake it. No one could mistake the voice telling that story for anybody other than Elizabeth Hardwick. And I think this is a truly Woolfian lesson, that what you want ultimately is to be able to convey a story, a structure of feeling and experience, a pattern of thought that is shared among many people. But the way that you stitch your words together has to be so distinct, so unique, that a sense of personality will always exceed the impersonality being asserted in the telling of the story. And that dialectic between the personal and the impersonal is so wonderfully and uniquely, to me, Woolfian, particularly when it comes to the kinds of stories told by and about women, that I look for it everywhere. And I think it really knits together the kinds of novelists and the kinds of critics that I most admire.
She's teasing or mocking male power all the time. But how would she define her own feminism in 1925?
Well, I think she's doing certain stylistic or formal things in Mrs. Dalloway that she will then claim as feminist in, for instance, an essay like A Room of One's Own.
Yeah.
And one of the, I think, quite remarkable arguments that she makes there is that if women are to have a literary tradition of their own, that tradition has to be detached from ideas of authority and of individual genius. What women need is a tradition that recognizes the experience of the mass. And they need a literary style or a literary form that aspires to collectivity as opposed to individuality, that is more interested in anonymity and impersonality than in the assertion of the individual ego. And I think that one of the reasons why she wants to create this mist, this shared consciousness in Mrs. Dalloway, is that for her, that is implicitly a feminist project. It is implicitly a feminist project to be able to capture the life mind of a people rather than the egocentric thoughts and feelings of just one person, which isn't to say that there aren't individual people in this novel. Of course there are, Clarissa Dalloway being the primary example. But in her diaries, Woolf is very anxious that she bring innumerable other characters to support Mrs. Dalloway so that it doesn't become a novel entirely fixated on the experience of the individual.
There's a collectivity here, even just in reading her. I'm no expert on Proust, but Proust gives me that same sense that she does of all of us being in one cosmic conversation together. But I also want to toss back my favorite example of the rapture in her world, which is, of course, suspicious in certain ways. But one of Virginia Woolf's models for Clarissa Dalloway apparently was a real friend of Virginia Woolf's, Kitty Maxey, who, she said, would look in the mirror every morning and make sure to think, gracious heavens, I'm alive. And then she would ask herself, now, am I more alive or less alive? And she would take her temperature to confirm her answer. But we got to get to the darker side of this book, embodied in poor, deranged Septimus Smith sitting in Regent's Park. He's given to his own wild excitement about life, about leaves on elm trees and the beauty of sparrows fluttering, to the point that tears ran down his cheeks. And random sounds in the park make harmonies. A child crying, or far away a horn sounded. And he says, all taken together meant the birth of a new religion. His wife frets that people are noticing her helpless husband weeping in the park. But there's the other side of this book. And of course, we all know, everybody knows that Virginia Woolf herself, in the end, love of life or not, committed suicide.
You know, one of the things that I find so incredible about this book is that despite its relatively slim size, it's not a very long book. Every time I reread it, every time I teach it, and every time I speak to someone about it, I discover something new. So the way that you just paraphrased and quoted the section on Septimus Smith sitting in Regent's Park immediately draws parallels between the section of the novel that I read a bit earlier, which is about the sound and the music of London. Of course, as I was reading that, I was thinking that one of the things that's marvelous about that passage is that you get the full panorama of that street. You see all of the people making noise on it, but it's relatively orderly. If you looked at that sentence on the page, you would see that all of those individual sounds or pairs of sounds are joined to one another by a series of clauses separated by semicolons. There's a real logic to that sentence. The section that you just read on Septimus Smith is from the point of view of a man who can't turn all of the sounds that he's hearing, the child crying, the barrel organ, the horn honking, into anything logical. He can't give it form. We need form in order for the sensory inputs, for lack of a better phrase, that assault us every day, not to become utterly overwhelming. But Septimus is utterly overwhelmed. He's sitting there weeping. He can't transform all the sounds and sights he's encountering in the world into something like a philosophy of life, into something sane, into something that he can live with.
He's hoping for religion or something.
Yeah, he's hoping for religion. That's exactly right. He's hoping for a kind of transcendence that takes him out of the world of the human into something divine, something otherworldly. Clarissa Dalloway, by contrast, is very much rooted in the world of the human. Those sentences ground her in the city. You feel her walking around. But this might be the difference between sanity and insanity. Sanity is capable of giving form to the otherwise overwhelming world of the senses. Insanity is not. And one of my favorite diary entries of Virginia Woolf's when she's writing Mrs. Dalloway is about exactly that scene in Regent's Park, because she gives to Septimus Smith many of her own hallucinations that she experienced when she had her nervous breakdowns. And she says that she can barely write the scenes in Regent's Park. They make her squint. She can eke them out at about 50 words a day.
Wow. I wanted to get to that. We knew, but you make it so poignant. She knew the agonies of Septimus Smith.
I think she absolutely did. And I think people are always a little wary of really easy biographical readings. One never wants to claim that because the author committed suicide, their suicide was somehow prophesied or signaled by the fact that her character committed suicide. But I think it's inevitable that you think about that when you read about Septimus. The suicide note that she wrote and left to her husband, Leonard, before she drowned herself in the river outside of their house, or just beyond the property line of their house. And one of the things that she says in that suicide note is that she can't concentrate.
Yes.
And I think one aspect of Septimus's insanity, his madness, is an inability to concentrate. There is too much world for him. He can't pick out one thing in it and focus his mind. It all just comes rushing in a way that can't be organized, can't be distilled into an essence, into a moment. And so I think there are real parallels there between the insanity that we see in Mrs. Dalloway and Woolf's own sense of life being a constant act of concentrating and reconcentrating your attention so that you could catch the beauty of it, so that you could fix those moments of being, as she calls them in her essay collection.
Before we leave Septimus Smith, if there is a villain in this book, it is the high-priced psychiatrist Sir William Bradshaw of Harley Street, who wants Septimus Smith confined, but he won't tell Septimus that he's gravely ill and in terrible danger. Medicine is a racket and a scandal in Mrs. Dalloway, which raises, for me, a question of Virginia Woolf's politics. She is angry about medical bullying. She's very alert to rampant inequality and injustice across her society. But then what? Is there a politics coming out of these implications?
I think there is a deeply anti-colonial politics to this novel. I think Dr. Bradshaw is the foremost proponent of proportion, of proportion in how one feels. And one of my favorite essays on this novel is by the great critic Alex Zwerdling. Zwerdling's argument, which I find very compelling, is that this is a novel in which the upper class, the elites, are embodiments of proportion, which means that they never feel to excess. Their feelings are always restrained. Their feelings are repressed. So for the upper class of this novel, there's actually no capacity to feel death. And because there's no capacity to feel death or to mourn for those who have died, there is, in turn, no capacity for life. Then there are characters who have no proportion whatsoever in their sense of feeling, and Septimus Smith is one of them. And for Zwerdling, the characters in the middle are characters like Clarissa Dalloway, Peter Walsh, and Sally Seton, who have this memory of their youthful exuberance, of their youthful erotic experiences, but time has quelled those feelings. And so they're stuck in between these characters who have no capacity for life, no capacity for feeling, and characters who have too much. And this is a distribution of feeling that has a politics to it. It's really about the inability of the upper classes to feel and the excess of feeling that's kind of bequeathed to the lower classes and the middle ground in between them.
Mrs. Dalloway, as you say, is just full of cultural markers, not least about love and sex, including the lesbian thrill of Clarissa Dalloway's own flashbacks to her growing up. But this question of love, she asks herself, this falling in love with women. Take, as you mentioned, Sally Seton. Her relation in the old days with Sally Seton. Had not that, after all, been love, she asks. She's recalling a country house evening when she could not take her eyes off Sally's extraordinary beauty. The strange thing on looking back, she remembers, was the purity, the integrity of her feeling for Sally. It was not like one's feelings for a man. And then, for Clarissa Dalloway, came the most exquisite moment of her whole life. They were passing a stone urn with flowers in it. Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lips. The whole world might have turned upside down. Their friends disappeared. There she was, alone with Sally, and she felt that she had been given a present, wrapped up and told just to keep it, not to look at it, a diamond, something infinitely precious, which she uncovered. Or the radiance burnt through, the revelation, the religious feeling. When suddenly their friends, Joseph and Peter, are standing there facing them. Stargazing, said Peter, in the role of sort of overbearing male. What do we make of that in the present day? To my mind, I just volunteer that it's the kind of relaxed memory of it, much more relaxed than those relations would be today.
One of the things I love about this moment, and it is very much a moment for Woolf. That's a word that repeats over and over again.
Yes, lots of moments.
Lots of moments. And it makes the connection, actually, as you were saying, to Proust, who is similarly fixated on moments and on how one remembers certain moments and why one remembers certain moments in one's life. But one of the things that I love about this is she remembers this. She's a 50-year-old woman sitting in her attic room looking at her own face in the mirror. And she is trying to think about who she is. And I suspect many of us have this experience where we catch a glimpse of ourselves in the mirror and we look at the face looking back at us very, very closely. And we think, well, this is who I am now. But how is it possible that this face, this body, this mind contained so many previous iterations of who I was as a child, who I was as a teenager, who I was as a young adult, who I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, who I am now at this very moment that I'm looking into this mirror. And for me, this is, yes, a moment of unbelievable lesbian eroticism, the only kiss in anything Virginia Woolf wrote after The Voyage Out.
Oh, wow.
But even more than that, it's an attempt to figure out, how does that moment still live in me? How do I, as a person, contain everything that has happened to me, even if my life situation, now that I'm 50, is so far away from my life situation when I was an adolescent girl? And can I, if I think hard enough, if I feel intensely enough, almost re-inhabit that moment so that past and present feel like they are here in me at the same time?
Merve, do you have that passage at hand? It struck me too. She talks about how many million times have I looked at my face or considered it, and then she describes it. The bird-like, jay-like, beaked face.
Yes, let me see if I can find it for you. Here it is. Here it is. She's looking into the glass and she's seeing...
Right after the kiss.
Yes, this is right after the kiss. She's seeing the delicate pink face of the woman who was that very night to give a party, of Clarissa Dalloway, of herself. And now here's the paragraph that follows. How many million times she had seen her face, and always with the same imperceptible contraction. She pursed her lips when she looked in the glass. It was to give her face point. That was herself, pointed, dart-like, definite. That was herself when some effort, some call on her to be herself, drew the parts together. She alone knew how different, how incompatible and composed, so for the world only into one center, one diamond, one woman who sat in her drawing room and made a meeting point, a radiancy no doubt in some dull lives, a refuge for the lonely to come to perhaps. She had helped young people who were grateful to her, had tried to be the same always, never showing a sign of all the other sides of her, faults, jealousies, vanities, suspicions. Like this of Lady Bruton not asking her to lunch, which she thought, combing her hair finally, is utterly base. Now, where was her dress? I love that passage because the way she purses her lips when she looks in the glass to come into contact with herself, it's like a sort of proto-selfie that we're getting there. We're getting a sort of contraction of that face in the mirror, the face that one presents to meet all the other faces that one meets, to quote, I think incorrectly, T.S. Eliot. But there is this idea that what we do when we present ourselves as social beings is to make ourselves more coherent than we really are. She knows that she is full of contradictions, faults, jealousies, vanities, suspicions, at the same time that she is full of radiance and empathy, that she is a refuge for the lonely to come to. And I think what she's grappling with as she's sitting in front of that mirror is, how can one woman, how can one person, one utterly ordinary person in many ways, be so many things?
That's marvelous. All of this on the way to Mrs. Dalloway's party that evening. But can I say, when we finally get to the party, it falls flat to my taste. Maybe I'm missing something, but the Prime Minister comes, but he's not interesting. Nobody says anything particularly memorable. And I was wondering, is it fair to be reminded of the faces of our own power elite on display these days at the Mar-a-Lago forever, at the Trump inauguration, notably? Bridging the scenes and the eras may be our sense on both occasions that worlds are at risk of crumbling. This isn't quite real in 1925 or 2025. That this is what time running out feels like, even looks like. As in the second Trump state visit to Windsor Castle and the royal family of England.
Yeah, I often think of Peter Walsh's impressions of London as he is walking through Westminster to go to the party. And here is how he sees it, or here is what he sees. Doors were being opened here by a footman to let issue a high-stepping old dame in buckled shoes with 3 purple ostrich feathers in her hair. Doors were being opened for ladies wrapped like mummies in shawls with bright flowers on them, ladies with bare heads. I'm skipping down a little bit in this paragraph. And Whitehall was skated over, silver beaten as it was, skated over by spiders. And there was a sense of midges round the arc lamps. It was so hot that people stood about talking. And here in Westminster was a retired judge, presumably, sitting foursquare at his house door dressed all in white, an Anglo-Indian, presumably. Woolf describes this for Peter as a cold stream of visual impressions that fail him. And I'm so struck by how those visual impressions are all touched by death and a sense of desiccation. That high-stepping old dame, the ladies wrapped like mummies, Whitehall skated over by spiders, the judge, the Anglo-Indian judge, sitting at his house door dressed in white. It's as if these people are already shrouded, as if they're already dead. The party that Peter is going to is, in fact, a funeral for the remnants of the empire, the high-stepping old dames, the ladies, the Anglo-Indians who've done the business of the empire in the colonies. And Peter Walsh, who's always playing with his pocket knife, walks into Clarissa Dalloway's house, opening the big blade of his pocket knife. That's the last sentence before he steps in. So there really is, to me, this sense of the party as a kind of funeral.
Wow.
And so it's entirely appropriate that who should show up to this funeral but Dr. Bradshaw, bringing news of Septimus Smith's death to Clarissa Dalloway. And that's what the whole day has been leading up to.
That's an issue. We'll get back to Peter Walsh, but I wanted to revert to the persistent question in my head reading Mrs. Dalloway, which was, what is it I'm so enjoying here? It's everything, but it might just be, in the end, the comprehensively female perspective. You quoted a lot of it just now on male power, and typically the vanity, the absurdity, the death drive in all that war and empire, and all the bronze statues in London in honor of the male ego. But in the end, what I'm most enjoying might just be Clarissa Dalloway herself, as seen by that restless Peter Walsh, who never quite gave up on his own passion to marry her.
Mm.
And as the Dalloway party is breaking up, Peter sits and watches and says to himself, "What is this terror? What is this ecstasy?" He thought to himself. "What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement?" "It is Clarissa," he said, for there she was.
Mm.
That's the end of the book.
It's an extraordinary end, isn't it? In her diary, Woolf had planned to give us these visions of Clarissa from 3 different people's points of view. We were supposed to see her at the end from Richard's point of view, from Sally's point of view.
Her husband.
Yes, her husband Richard's point of view.
Member of Parliament, generally dull guy.
Conservative MP who we have a kind of wonderfully, I think, funny stretch in the novel where he's walking through London and he decides to buy his wife flowers, but he can't bring himself to tell her that he loves her. And that goes back to that sense of repression that I was speaking about earlier. He can't quite bring himself to tell his wife that he loves her. So Woolf had planned to give us these sightings of Clarissa from these 3 different people's points of view. And in the end, we really only get her from Peter's point of view. What's so wonderful about it is that we don't quite know where she is. We don't know exactly what Peter is seeing. Is she on the stairs? Is she talking to somebody else? All we know are the feelings that she inspires in him. The terror, the ecstasy, the extraordinary excitement. And we know that Peter, like Sally, like Clarissa, might be 55 in body, but they have the hearts of people of 20. So even though we are at this party, and this party is effectively a kind of funeral, and the novel is itself, I think, an elegy, not only for all of the people who've died in the war or from influenza, but also for an entire way of life, it also preserves that youthful glow, that youthful sense of possibility that we get in Peter looking up at Clarissa and thinking, there she was.
The next to last great closing line in this book is spoken by, of all people, old friend Sally Seton of the lesbian kiss.
Yeah.
The most exciting moment in Clarissa's life, she said. And she says at the very end, she's at the party, and she has this closing line for her: "What does the brain matter compared with the heart?"
Yeah, that's lovely, isn't it?
It is. Before we're done, though, I want to go back to the rest of the story of Virginia Woolf. Do we think of her in the end? This is too simplistic, but then all of these dualities are. Do we think of Virginia Woolf in the end as part of the sane lovers of life or of the insane lovers of life after her suicide?
That's such a difficult question. It's very important to remember that in 1941, when she decided to take her own life, she was hearing bombs dropping every day. She was...
That's Septimus all the way.
Yeah, she was seeing German planes flying overhead. She would be on the phone with a friend, and the friend would say, "There are bombs falling around me," and then the telephone would cut out, and she wouldn't know what had happened, and she would have to go about her day not knowing. There was the real terror that Hitler was going to invade, and that they would all die. So I think it's very, very important to recognize that under those conditions in which the possibility of living under an expanded Nazi state seemed very real, it would not actually be insane to opt out of life. If you imagined that you were going to die because a bomb fell on your house. Or you imagined that your husband, who was Jewish, might be rounded up by Hitler if he invaded England. Then choosing to take your own life, choosing to die in the way that you wanted to die, as opposed to dying at the mercy of a bomb falling from an airplane, might in fact present itself as a completely rational choice. So I think, as you said, these binaries are too simplistic, and one way to make them appropriately complicated is to remember that her decision to take her own life took place under extraordinarily terrifying circumstances, world historical circumstances.
Merve Emre, thank you so much. Between Mrs. Dalloway and you, I feel relaunched as a Virginia Woolf reader. There's a lot to read. Thank you so much, Merve.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really, really delightful conversation, and you've made me see things about the novel that I hadn't seen before,
no.
So thank you.
The very close reader, Merve Emre, wrote an introduction and a host of historical details for the annotated Mrs. Dalloway. She's a professor of creative writing and criticism at Wesleyan University. Her work appears frequently in the New Yorker magazine and the New York Review of Books. Our conversation here at Open Source relies on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now is the time to go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to politics to technology to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important now than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you